All right, so what's going to happen, just to orient everyone to our shared presentation today, Angeli and I are going to take in turns with the slides, and on some slides we both have something that we'd like to say. So Angeli, as I'm sharing, for your slides, when you've finished, if you be Chris Whitty and say next slide please, I'll go ahead and change the slide this end for you.
All right, I'll just put my Chris Whitty hat on.
Brilliant. Perfect. So shall we introduce ourselves first? Angeli, would you like to go first?
Yes, okay, so apologies that my name says that I'm Daniel and Angeli Bone. I won't dwell on that, but in fact my name's Angeli Vaid. I'm a parent carer, so family carer of a young man who has autism and learning disabilities, but I also should say that I do a lot in the PPI world, both as a lead on some NAHR projects and yeah, on quite a range actually, but also as a member of various PPI groups. So I've also got a background in the arts where I've worked a lot around audience participation and evaluation of those experiences.
Thanks, and hi, I'm Charlotte Albury. I'm a research fellow and qualitative methodologist at the University of Oxford, and together with Angeli we put together a grant application to find out how to best co-design training really for co-researchers who'd like to do ethnography. And for anyone who doesn't know, ethnography is a type of research where you sort of hang out with somebody to find out about their lives. And the project that our PPI, smaller PPI project related to was looking to train co-researchers, and we were the team that got together to find out how best to do that. And I think, Angeli, you're going to go ahead and introduce the team.
I am. So the first thing to say is that we've got a couple of people who aren't here on the team, which is my fault. I did try to insert them and then I realised they hadn't been inserted. But so the two people who aren't here are, like me, family carers of a family member with a learning disability. So they're Kathy and Sam. So they're with us in spirit. We've got next to me, we've got Dr. Sarah Ryan, or Professor Sarah Ryan, who herself was a family carer, but in fact is was the sort of academic lead, if you like, on this project. I've got Charlotte next to Sarah, and then at the top, Lisa Davison, who is a support worker for Pam, who is sitting underneath her, and Pam has got a learning disability, but also is her paid work is as a consultant for an organisation called My Life, My Choice. Magdalena is next to Pam, who's another academic working on the project with Charlotte, and then Jenny Carter is next to Magdalena. So Jenny works for an organisation whose name I can't remember, based in Liverpool and the Wirral, and is also a consultant, self-advocate, and a person with a learning disability. So that's us.
Yeah, and Jenny works with Together All Are Able.
Oh, thank you, thank you. So is this me, Charlotte?
Yes, it is.
I haven't got the notes. So this is what we produce. So we thought we'd start off by showing you what we were aiming to do. It's a bit difficult to describe, but this is what, if you can fast forward to the end of our project, this is what we produced. And it's, as you can see, it's an easy read, which is a format very helpful for people who don't have an ability to read English, written English very fluently, and need extra support to do that. So this is the easy read version that we used, well, we've put together, and it explains, it really pulls together our findings as a group and what we feel people needed to know. I'm aware that it's probably quite small on your screens. It certainly is quite small on mine, but basically it sets out what an ethnography is and what you need to do and how you need to plan for a piece of ethnographic research. Okay, so this is the next piece of work that we produced. So they're all on A4, just on one A4 piece of paper. Now this has got a lot more words than that, and so therefore probably so would need some interpretation, and we have actually gone on to do that. But this, we defined, this is all the work we did, all the stuff that we talked about, and this is what we produced at the end of it. So we're really proud of it. So step one was how we would design it, the things we would do to think about it. Step two, the activities that we would plan to do it. Then step three is how we would actually do it. And then we would debrief, so we'd support each other and talk about it. And then step three and step four sort of go round in a circle. So it's an iterative process. So we understood that, you know, you didn't just get to the end of it. You might go back and ask questions again. I actually don't know why I'm making my head go around. I think it's that to sort of, you know, emphasize the point. And we thought about some of the questions that you could ask when you're doing an ethnography. So I think it's just important to bring people back to understanding that the sort of work we were thinking about is, as people with learning disabilities and as family carers who support somebody with a learning disability, what we wanted to do was to be able to work with participants, study participants who have learning disabilities, so that we can hear about their experiences and learn about that. So these resources are particularly focused on doing that work with people with learning disabilities and their families.
Thanks, Angeli. So we produced these, essentially it's one guide actually in 3 different formats. So one of the things that we learned from working together is that some people felt that they really would like an easy read version. Other people felt that a flowchart was better than them, and other people, as illustrated in our 3rd version of the same guide, preferred to see things in organised lists. So what we did as part of the co-design process was develop this resource but have the same thing in 3 different formats, so that people could choose the version of the resource that best suited them. And that was a really big learning point from me from working on this project, that we could all work in different ways, we could all use the same resource, but adjust it very slightly so people get that choice when they're training each other or working on a project to choose which of these fits best for them. So as part of our grant, this is what we produced, these 3 sort of guides, one guide in 3 different versions. But we also said as part of our grant that we'd reflect on the process of co-designing these things as a team, including the challenges we faced, what we learnt. Angeli and I sort of thought that this webinar would be a good point to think and reflect on those challenges and learnings, which is what we're going to go ahead and share with you now. So over to you, Angeli, for why we did it.
Okay, yeah, so so why bother? I mean, why is this important? But I think the first thing to say is that all researchers, you know, whether you're researching which car to buy or which school to send your child to, or whether you're an academic researcher or you're a co-researcher, need some training and development to do a good job. You need to learn how to do that job. And what we discovered was that actually there's very little training around for co-researchers in this situation. There didn't seem to be anything, there was very little out there, but even less for people with learning disabilities and family carers. And we are the ones who are best placed, I should say, to say what we need to do a good job. So we were concerned about that. And we did find some examples, but and they were good, they are excellent. However, they're written by academics for co-researchers. In fact, one of our colleagues on another project wrote them and delivers them wonderfully. But they're very much, and I think she would say the same, delivered from an academic perspective to a co-researcher, in this case somebody with a learning disability who's an excellent co-researcher. But we felt it was important to roll it back a step, and our training was created with a team, and we felt that this was co-production in action. So the idea is that we we step right back and we're right in from the absolute sort of start of the project, to the point, as you'll find out in a minute, that I actually wrote the grant application with Charlotte.
Yeah, thanks, Angeli. So yeah, the kind of the first thing that we did together was writing the application, and it was a really great experience. It was nice. I never met Angeli before. It was brilliant to meet Angeli and work with her, but it did have its challenges as well. And we said, you know, in this chat we'd reflect on what we learned, but also what was a little bit challenging, so other people can maybe discuss those things with us. But what we found or what I found initially was quite tricky, was that I knew it was really important to work with Angeli. I knew that I couldn't write this grant on my own. I didn't have enough knowledge. But the tricky thing was that PPI at this really early stage, like before we've got funding, isn't funded. So I found it personally quite difficult to ask Angeli for her time and her skill and knowledge and input when I couldn't reimburse her for spending that time. But luckily in this instance, we found that because our project was nested within this wider project that will be using our training, Angeli could be funded as part of that project, which meant that we could work well together and a bit more equitably on working on the grant application. But it was the first time Angeli had worked with an academic researcher to write a grant, and maybe she's going to talk a bit more later about how that felt. But I found that I needed to be really honest with Angeli about what I knew and what I didn't know. So we had to get to know each other quite quickly and be really honest with each other as we were writing the application. But what I did find personally, that the form to me seemed much simpler than the type of grant forms I'm used to filling out. It was much briefer, the wording was a lot plainer. But what I learned from Angeli was that actually she's also experienced in filling out grant applications for things like the lottery, but compared to those, it was a much more complex application form with words that I knew because I work in research, but people who don't work in that field wouldn't know about. So again, we had to work together to think through the application form and work through the challenges of a form that was designed for researchers and not so much for people who don't work so commonly in the research field.
That's absolutely right. As part of my arts world, I do, you know, write big bids and support people to have worked on some really big projects, which of course will have their own language, but just words like dissemination, no idea what that meant, absolutely none. And that felt quite frustrating because I think I might have been able to be more helpful if I'd understood the language. And I also, to be absolutely honest, didn't entirely understand what Charlotte's job was. To be absolutely honest, I still struggle a bit in that respect. So that was a bit weird because I'm used to working with people and I really understand what they do and why they do it. But I think it's probably almost exactly the same for Charlotte, in the sense that she wasn't entirely clear what I did either. So there's a bit of a leap of faith there. But that is quite strange when you're working with people and you don't have a full grasp of absolutely everything they do. You just sort of hope that you have, you know, you've come to some common ground.
And I think we did get there, Angeli, but, and we got a great things in the end, but it was that kind of honesty and that kind of initial, oh my goodness, what are we doing? That took a bit of working through. Another thing that was tricky about the application, because we wanted to co-design this training, right? We didn't know what the training was going to look like. And if we designed the training in advance, then it wasn't really going to be co-designed. So another thing that we struggled with was needing to say and state costs for what we needed in the application and needing to kind of hint at what our outcomes would be when actually we didn't know. And it was a good thing that we didn't know because we were going to co-design it with a team that we hadn't recruited yet. So again, we had to think quite creatively about how to meet the demands of the grant application whilst also staying true to the co-design that we wanted to do later and being really honest and saying, we don't know what we're going to produce. We don't know what we're going to find out, but actually we think that's a strength of this project. So yes, that was another thing that we had to think quite carefully about. Yeah,
for example, we might have produced a film at the end of it, or we might have produced a photographic exhibition, or we might have invited people to an event to talk about it. So that's what we mean. We weren't necessarily expecting to produce a guide at the end of it.
And the reason that we did produce a guide is because that's what the team together felt was most helpful. And Angie's going to talk now about how we recruited that team.
Yeah, so Sarah, Dr. Sarah Ryan and Professor Sarah Ryan and I are both very sort of well networked in the learning disability world. It's an area that I work in a lot, but also just living and working in a community in Oxford for so many years and raising children in that way and meeting my neighbours and having a sense of connection meant that actually I was well connected and had worked with a lot of people all over the place, so that was very helpful, I think. And likewise, Sarah, as an academic researcher in learning disability, had also got a whole kind of notebook of people she could contact. I think that was a real advantage for us. I note that Jemima was saying, you know, for academic researchers that can be a real problem, and I agree, and which is why you need a Wesley who can hold your hand and say, actually I've got this one, I know what I'm doing and I can help you with that. So I knew who to sort of go to and who to ask. There were Wesleys out there for me on this occasion and for us, and we very much wanted a range of views and experiences, and we were very conscious of gaps. So for example, there were no men, but what we did have was a range of experiences from family carers who got very much younger children to older children in a range of different circumstances, living at home, not living at home, and that was really important. And the same with people with learning disabilities, they've got a range of experiences as well.
Thanks, Angeli. So once we had recruited our team, this is what we did. So this is how we produced the guide that we showed you at the beginning of our presentation. We produced it very much iteratively through group discussion, and we had 3 meetings. From the very start of the very first meeting, didn't know what we were going to produce, and by the end of the 3rd meeting we were commenting, making sort of very fine-grained changes to the documents that we showed you at the beginning. So in the first meeting, we started really just by chatting about what ethnography is and what research is in general. And we realised that all of us, whether we were professional academic researchers or not, had got research experience. We all do research in our day-to-day lives to find out about stuff, but don't necessarily put that official research label on it. And we found out something very similar about ethnography as well. We started chatting about ethnography as this research method where you hang out with people and ask questions and observe. And the whole group said, oh yeah, I've got those skills. I know how to ask questions, I know how to hang out with people and observe and find out things. Those are skills that most of us have and use in our day-to-day lives. And that was really interesting because we'd planned to train people how to do ethnography. And our group said, actually, you know what, we know how to do that already. We just don't put this label on what we do and call it ethnography. We call it asking questions or hanging out. So rather than developing really detailed training in this is ethnography and this is this research method, what actually the group said that they would like or find most helpful was something to increase their confidence in using those skills that everyone had, but labelling them with this research term, ethnography, and being able to put them into practice in a research setting. And that really was where we kind of took that and ran with it. That's what people wanted, not official training with PowerPoint slides or a video, or we even thought about some cards with suggested ways to ask questions. People felt they had those skills. What they needed was something to support them to have confidence to put them into practice. And that's where the team sort of really came up with the idea for a written guide that people could read in advance, take with them with some suggestions on and some reminders about what ethnography is and how to put those skills into practice. The team also decided that as well as training co-researchers, we should also be training academic researchers who work with co-researchers, and that was really important, that we shouldn't just be saying to co-researchers, okay, this guide's for you, this is what you should be doing. The team wanted a mirror guide, and we showed it at the beginning. One was for co-researchers and one was for academic researchers, which outlines really clearly their responsibilities at each stage of the process, including what they can do to best support co-researchers. And again, that's something that I hadn't thought about and was such a valuable outcome of this co-design process. So we came up with these things over 3 meetings. Between each meeting, myself and Magdalena would go away, implement all the comments that people had made, feed it into a document, send it round to everyone. People would comment between meetings, we get it back, and gradually and iteratively develop this final guide, or these final 3 guides in the end that we showed you at the beginning of this presentation.
Okay, so it really literally did involve cats and dogs. So we did a mini ethnography on Zoom called Meeting My Pet, and we got this email, and it said, "It's time for you to find out about what life is like at the moment with the pet. You could ask questions about the pet or just hang out with the researchers." So all of us on the group, so family carers and our folk with learning disabilities, all had the opportunity to pry into the private lives of the academics on the project. Turns out Sarah, Magdalena and Charlotte all had a cat or a dog. So we had lots of choice about when we wanted to do it, how we wanted to do it, how long we wanted to do it for. So we zoomed in literally. So I spent a couple of hours, it turned out, meeting Charlotte and her cat Gatsby, as in Great Gatsby. And it was really interesting because what I discovered was it's very different interviewing somebody from observing somebody and just chatting to them in a very relaxed way. So for me, that was the biggest learning in the whole project. Just stepping out of the kind of the headspace into real time, really chatting, really watching, and what could I learn? And the feedback from the mini ethnography was really great. And I think it was at that point everybody began to really get it. I thought it was really cleverly done from my point of view, because it was very doable. I've got a busy family and I could just fit it in, and yeah, and so quite a lot of learning there. So it was, yeah, I feel I've got a special bond with Gatsby now.
And me, Angeli, I was there as well. I know that Gatsby was the star of the mini ethnography.
Yes, 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 no, I've forgotten about that. Yes, mine is Lisa, owner of Gatsby.
And this, we sort of came up with this idea because people, it seemed like a big jump to go from a guide on how to do ethnography to suddenly having to do it in real life. And we thought that this would be kind of a helpful middle step to put into practice those things people were learning from the guide, just to check how it was working and if people had any more questions, for example. So as well as working with Angeli, Sam, who was one of their family carers, also came to observe me and Gatsby. And Sam said it was a really useful part of the process because she realised she didn't have to ask questions all the time, that she could learn quite a lot from just looking and listening. And she was keen to put those skills into practice in future as well. So the mini ethnography made it into the training, and we kind of recommended that other co-researchers and academic researchers have a go at it before going out in the field together, to sort of build rapport, to get to know each other, but also to practice the skills that they're going to be using when they go and do research. So finally, we're at our final kind of co-step of the process, which was dissemination. So over to you, Angeli.
Well, now I've learned what the word dissemination is, and it means sharing what you have learnt widely, as far as I can understand. And so we shared our experiences. So we promised that we would write a blog on the NIHR website, which we did, but we did it as a group, and I pulled together some of the things that people had written. In fact, Charlotte and I pulled it together. I'm saying I did. In fact, it was the pair of us. And then that went up on the website, which was really nice. And probably the sort of grandest thing we did as a team was to co-author an academic article in the Journal of Learning Disability, which is coming out any moment, I guess. So this was a very proud moment for the family carers, especially, who one of the things about being a family carer is that you can often lose a lot of status. You can not work for many years. If you're caring, you can start to feel invisible. And I think for Sam and Kathy in particular, but me too, it felt really important that we were able to step into this space in this academic world where we were allowed to have our voices heard and co-author this article. So that felt like a very important step forward. I have to say, as a non-academic, it does feel a little bit odd, and I absolutely understand and get why these things have to be published in academic journals. But it's quite funny when you're not in that world to realise that that is such a big deal, and it's such a big thing. I get it in terms of our own personal achievements, and we were delighted. And it does mean that, you know, we're kind of up there. We've got that opportunity, but it was a curious thought that was a really important part of it, and that is still quite an academic sort of driven outcome, I would say. But although we're obviously round the table and, you know, invited to the party and all of that now, but it's interesting that was something that I think is very much part of the academic experience. Okay, so yes.
Great. So to wrap up, we're going to talk about our final learning and sort of top tips for anyone else who might be doing some co-design. So firstly, finance and funding. I found this a tricky one. So once we had the grant and we're kind of working this co-design process, I found that we as a team were trying really hard to make sure everything was as accessible as possible and as equitable as possible. But there's things that happen behind the scenes that we didn't have control of that could make things a bit tricky. So for example, for people to be reimbursed for their time, they had to fill out university mandated quite complex forms that were not very accessible. And for the family carers in particular, I helped them fill out the forms because it's really difficult if you're not an academic and not used to filling out large amounts of paperwork to be reimbursed for your time to do it. So we spent quite a lot of time together working out how to fill out the forms and how to sort of negotiate those processes. So I would say if you do something similar, bear in mind that those things take a lot of time. But they're important, so make sure you do have time allocated to support people, and if necessary to fight their corner with finance teams who might be very process driven and not understand how difficult their forms are to fill out.
Keeping an open mind about the outcomes. So you know, being imaginative, creative, pragmatic, so that you can you know, roll with the punches really and see what comes out of it. Appreciate that can be quite tricky in the grant form, but I'm hoping we've slightly paved the way.
The next thing is to acknowledge that as researchers we are intimidating, even if we try really hard not to be. And I found it quite surprising to find that I was intimidating, but I completely understand why. And what I did was try to be as honest as possible, that I was not very confident about what we were doing. I'd never done it before, and that we were all in the same boat. So acknowledging we're a team, we're all in the same boat together. I'm not this big researcher who's going to sit here and tell everyone what to do, was really key, I think, to make clear from the beginning that we were a team working together.
And this is echoing Jemima's point earlier, really. So it's very similar that family carers and people with learning disabilities do want to be involved. It is about asking and asking in the right way, and coming to the next point, using networks to recruit, word of mouth, you know, people that you know, sitting and chatting to people in community centres, cafes, getting out there and finding people that are going to help you to do the work that you need to do.
And finally, I think really is just to say we think co-design should be the way that things are done. It was surprising for us that there wasn't already co-design materials available, so we would highly recommend doing co-design. Yes, I think that's our sort of take-home point, isn't it, Angeli?
Yeah, absolutely it is. It's very difficult to think of a situation where co-design would not be appropriate. And I think the kind of received wisdom is that it can be very appropriate sometimes, but not other times. I think I'd want to sort of really challenge that, and think, you know, I think that's probably what people thought about training. It'd be great if academics could come up with training to teach co-researchers to do ethnography, and I think we've probably disproved that point. That's not to say additional training isn't important, but from the start, from the off, co-design is going to give you a much better outcome for that project, and is likely to be much more ethical as well. But I'll leave it there.
Brilliant, thank you. And that is it from us. Thanks everyone for listening.
Wonderful, thank you very much for presenting all of the work that you've done, and a lot of learning there as well. I definitely got some takeaway messages from your presentation. We don't have a lot of time for questions, so I see that there's one in the chat, so I'll ask those to the presenters, and then we're gonna continue onward to the next presentation. So the question that came in is that Angeli mentioned the academic journal output felt positive but odd. What would have been alternative ways from your perspective that you could have used to share the learning or to disseminate, to use the jargon?
Yeah, thanks, Miriam. That's a really good question. I was thinking about that as I was saying it. I think I suppose part of presenting is that, you know, I'm reflecting as I'm talking. I think for me it's the idea that you have to go through these academic hoops, and I understand why, you know, peer review and all of that. But I suppose it's the kudos that goes along with it. So as you can hear, I'm sort of very slightly conflicted about it. So I guess what would have been great would have been to have the opportunity and to be paid for the time to disseminate it through some of the networks where I know people with learning disabilities and family carers are more likely to see it and read it. It's highly unlikely that they will be thumbing through their copy of the Journal for Learning Disabilities today. Whereas, for example, if we'd been given some time and money to put it in the National Autistic Society magazine, for example, or their sort of Learning Disability England have a whole range of sort of networks and contacts. And that's not to say we can't, but it wasn't costed for in that project. So it's just interesting that that was the route that was chosen. It would probably much better reach the people who are likely to be impacted by it. And I suppose I know that doesn't hold the same academic weight, but it might have a much more impact in terms of the outcomes on the everyday lives of people with learning disabilities and their family carers.
Wonderful, thank you for that. Unfortunately, we won't have time for any other question as we'll go onwards to the third presentation.